Greetings once again, folks, and welcome to week 2 of the Social Work 290 course, Understanding Violence in Families. This chapter, the introductory chapter in your Barnett, Miller Perrin, and Perrin text really kind of looks a little bit at the history of violence in families and also how it is that we go about defining family violence. In this presentation, I've got some slides that I've actually added to the slides that the the publisher has suggested we use, although the bulk of the slides are ones that accompany the text, and I hope to be able to add to that as we go along during the semester. As I mentioned earlier, I have taught another course previously at Kenai Peninsula College on child abuse, neglect, and domestic violence, and there's some materials from that course that I'm going to weave into these presentations for you, so that hopefully you'll get some additional material beyond what you're reading in the text. For those if you're wondering about what happens with the tests and everything with the from week to week, the test questions are going to focus upon the material in the textbook itself, but the extra materials that I added is something that is still very useful for you, and I hope you will make note of them and use them as time goes on. So the author talks a little bit about what some of the objectives of the textbook are, and one of the things that you'll notice is, they say they provide estimates of the different types of assaults and information on scientific research involved in studying family violence. And I think I mentioned in my first week's talk with you that the text is rather heavy with statistics and tables and things like this, and what we need to do as we read this book really is to kind of develop the capacity to draw the essentials out of that material. While I think some of the questions in the test may look at the broader topics of statistics and things like that, really, I don't believe that, particular, like for instance, memorizing 47% of this or that is really all that important, is understanding that in most cases, or in some cases, or in very few cases, such and such occurs. So again, drawing the important materials out of the textbook is the thing that's going to be most important for us in this course. And I think as you go along and you get more used to reading this textbook, you'll be able to do that more adeptly if you feel any frustrations in reading through the first chapter or two. So we'll be looking at different theories of the causes of family violence, and also talking a little bit about the definitions of family violence, looking at various forms of abuse. And in this course, we're going to look at both child abuse and neglect, intimate partner violence, both in marriages and outside of marriages, intimate relationships outside of the family, but still ones that kind of are significant to individuals. We'll be looking at elder abuse, and also looking at implications about family violence across cultures and things like this. We're also going to spend a week, at least 1 week, outside of the material in the text, looking at the effects of family violence on children, which is something that's kind of an emerging field, and is something that's really very important for you to know as you go forward in this career. This particular chapter gives an overview of family violence, and we'll look at some of the following questions, such as when and how did family violence come to be recognized as a social problem, and how is family violence defined? Family violence from culture to culture is seen very differently, and in some cultures, I think it's debatable, that I don't think there's any culture that really endorses it and says that wife beating, for instance, is something that's acceptable and is good, but violence is tolerated in some cultures more than others, and I think that's sort of the important thing to draw from this. Heavy hands in relationships is something that is more of a cultural pattern in some cultures around the world than it is in others, and so that's some of the things that I think will help you understand that when we look at family violence, it's really not defined, really not seen the same around the world. And in fact, in our own history, some of the things that today are illegal or abhorred in relationships within families and systems and within intimate relationships have, over the centuries, been accepted and tolerated as something that was just sort of the norm. And so, historically speaking, we have come to discover family violence And we're still in the process in our culture of evolving its definition and in evolving its response, or rather our response to it. So first, and this is a little bit of material that's not in the textbook, in fact, but is some material from another text that I have used once. It's Cynthia Crossan Tower's book, Understanding Child Abuse and Neglect, by the way, if you're looking for a reference for this. And this is one of the things that she asks as she opens her discussion of the topics of violence in families is, what does family structure mean in and of itself? There are some things in order to understand what makes families work and work well. We need to understand what some of the elements of a family system is that builds that family. And the reason we look at this before we begin to look at family violence is I think that to understand why family systems go wrong, sometimes we need to begin with an understanding of what are some of the basic things that make family systems work right. And so this is what we're looking at here. For instance, one part of family structure is subsystems and boundaries. If you kind of think of a family as a unit and let's say just picture a circle, and within that circle is where the family unit exists, and within that circle there are pie slices, let's say, that define the various systems within the family, so that we have the parental subsystem, the mother and the father. We have the sibling unit. We have the units of males, the units of females, those kinds of things. So one individual may be in different subsystems within the family, and at different times maybe can have alliances with different people in the family because of the different dynamics that are going on. For instance, when we're selecting TV shows and just to kind of be purely sexist, about this, traditional or whatever, on a Sunday afternoon, the men want to watch the football game and, the women don't. And so the men kind of line up, the boys and the men kind of line up and take control of the television and enjoy football together while the women wander off and do other things, for instance. Sort of sometimes the male and the female subsystems gather together and ally. Individuals develop alliances within those subsystems to bring things about in the family. However, at times when, for instance, major decisions are made in the household, the parental subsystem is probably the unit that is making those decisions, and that is a male and a female working together in most, not all, but most family systems. And the sibling subsystem isn't necessarily brought into, or the children's subsystem isn't brought into that decision-making process, or in some families they are. But so again, you see different kind of systems and subsystems within a family and boundaries within those systems, so that there are certain things that occur within the parental subsystem that do not involve the children. Perhaps, intimate interactions and things like that would be one thing. Sexual interactions, those kinds of things in a healthy system and a healthy family system doesn't cross generational boundaries like that. And so, and another thing, as long as we're talking about privacy and things like that, as children, when children are young, for instance, little boys and girls might be put in the bathtub together by their parents. But as they reach adolescence, let's say, boys and girls are not in the bathroom together at the same time in most homes and things like that. So that's an example of boundaries. And again, family structures will have healthy boundaries. Now, aside from the family unit itself and the boundaries within the family unit should have boundaries around itself that makes it distinct from the rest of the world. I think of a time when I was in high school, I developed a relationship, a friendship with a fellow who was actually taken in by another friend's family and raised as their own child, even though his father lived down the street, 3 or 4 doors down the street, and just wasn't interested in parenting him at all. And his mother lived in the city nearby, so she wasn't taking care of him. He kind of just migrated or gravitated to this family, and they took him in and literally raised him through high school and into his young adult years as though he were his own. He was their own. When I would go to visit, I would be welcome to that household. I could stay there till 2 o'clock in the morning if for whatever reason I decided to stay there overnight and just kind of crash on the couch. If they came down the steps in the morning and found me sleeping on the couch, there wouldn't have been any issue made about it at all. This is kind of the way this family system was, and it was what we would call very permeable boundaries, perhaps diffused boundaries, where people kind of came and went. Now, everybody knew who the family members were that lived there all the time, the brothers and the sisters, and in particular, my young friend, all belonged there and lived there. But they welcomed people from the outside, and so there was constantly an array of individuals coming and going in that home. That kind of made it very lively and kind of made it fun to be around sometimes. My own home, my own family was really quite different. And while I was able to bring my friends into the home, there was a certain time of the night, and this is sort of how I run my own family. There's a certain time of the night when guests need to leave, and we settle down as a family unit and begin to relax and prepare to go for bed or whatever it is we're getting ready for. There's certain times when the telephone should stop ringing and the phone should be put down and the text messages stop flying and those kinds of things, so that we pull within ourselves. And so our definition of boundaries between this family that I grew up in and my friend's family where he was raised were very different. Now, I think both were healthy families, but both had different definitions of boundaries, and so even though family systems do differ in terms of their boundaries and structure, there are many, many variations of those families, and understanding that the individual family sometimes helps you begin to understand or assess whether or not the boundaries are healthy or not. Boundaries can be very rigid, where individuals can't come in. Individuals in the parental subsystem, for instance, may isolate members in the household, and this is a typical kind of a thing that abusive family or individuals will do with their family, and we'll be studying this as the semester goes along. And there's a number of unhealthy things about very rigid boundaries. By the same time, at the other end, a family system, in order to have some integrity, has to have some boundaries, and that's where the diffusion of boundaries can become very unhealthy as well. So I would say probably permeable boundaries, and there's a wide variety of definitions, of extremes, let's say, in what means permeable. But permeable boundaries are probably the healthiest thing, that lets information in, lets information out, but still there's a boundary that's very recognizable there. So that's just a very mini course on family systems, and at some point, most likely you'll be studying more about family systems, and this is a very interesting way of kind of assessing and understanding families, is looking at their subsystems and their boundaries. Family structure also involves roles. As you can see, the different kinds of roles that individuals have. And as one person in the family, you have many different roles. So you may be the parent. Let's say in my household, I'm the parent. I'm the breadwinner. I'm a single dad, so I am the breadwinner in this household. Most of the time, I'm the cook, although occasionally I can rope my adolescent into cooking a meal. Not very often, but on occasion. The nurturer, as a single dad, I also have to kind of play the nurturer in the family, and sometimes can be a challenge with an adolescent son who, struggles with this notion of whether men can be nurturers or not. Of course we can, but the social definitions suggest that we shouldn't be, those kinds of things. So very different roles. We all have several of them within the family, and sometimes when there's conflicts in family, it may relate to, or unhappiness in one's life in the family, it may relate to the fact that we have conflicting roles where we can't fill both at the same time, even though we're supposed to. Roles can be functional, roles can be dysfunctional, and again, we'll just leave it at that because there'll be more talk about that as the semester goes along. Another aspect of structure in families are communication patterns, because communication is the thing that helps to keep the family working. It, as this slide suggests, it regulates the systems and the boundaries and the roles. It delivers instructions. It brings communication back and forth between members that explain how individuals feel and how they're getting along and where they're at, so to speak. And so communication patterns are very important. And it is the rules. Different families have many different rules about how we communicate with each other, so that some families, and we all know those individuals, are very direct in what they have to say. They pull no punches. They just tell you what it is. And sometimes those families, you may know some families that are just they're characterized by a lot of conflict. That doesn't mean that the family life is unhappy necessarily, or unhealthy, but the style of communication is so direct that they tend to come into a lot of conflict with each other. Other families are much more indirect and very gentle and kind, and they suggest things. And for people who really want instructions or directions, it can drive you crazy sometimes, being in an indirect, in a home where there's a lot of indirect communication. If you read my bio, you know that I've hosted a lot of foreign exchange students, and one of the things that I learned from my European kids is that Americans are noted for being rather indirect in their communication as a culture. So that if I ask to have the dishwasher unloaded before I get home at night, and I come home and I find the dishwasher hasn't been unloaded, I might not just go to my son and say, "You didn't unload the dishwasher, get your butt in there and do it." I may say, "Somebody forgot to empty the dishwasher." and I can remember one of my European students saying to me, "And would that somebody be me, perhaps?" So again, direct or indirect. Are we ambiguous? Sometimes communication be contradictory, can be very restricted. There are rules within families that define the kind of communication that goes on among its members. We also can look at families in terms of bonding and attachments. And again, healthy families give an infant and an opportunity to bond with an adult, and we carry that bond throughout our childhood and into our adulthood, with each other. And that bond, that attachment carries us through many, many difficult times and helps us in many ways that we'll be talking about as the semester goes along. When without this bonding, without this attachment, we experience difficulties in our relationships as adults and other kinds of emotional and behavioral problems, because we just learn so much about ourselves and the world and how to relate to other people through our relationships with our parents and our siblings. Family rituals is another thing that's worth also noting. Healthy families have rituals. They may be day-to-day rituals. Who gets up first? Who gets the shower first? Who cooks breakfast? Who puts the dishes away? Who makes sure that everybody's lunch is packed? Who drives people to the activities, those kinds of things. This ritual, the dinner is after so-and-so gets home every night. And, once that's done, homework occurs, and maybe the family talks over the dinner table, but nobody talks when the television is on. There are different kinds of things that go on in a household every day that make life predictable and make home, feel like home. That's what it is, that comfortable pair of shoes that we put on when we come home, and we have a ritual that we go through every day. Now, occasionally we may feel a little stifled and a little bored with that, but there's a value in that predictability, and it gives us a sense of security and protection from the outside world. Likewise, we have rituals around family events like weddings, funerals, graduations, birthdays, those kinds of things. Rituals around holidays, perhaps, how we decorate our Christmas tree if we have a Christmas tree, what we do on summer vacation, those types of things. And life cycle rituals as well, like the launching of children, for instance, or once again, weddings and funerals. Do families get together for funerals or not? Now, well-structured families tend to have rituals for most of these types of events, and as well as others. And you'll see in your work over the years that when you work with families that are dysfunctional, oftentimes the dysfunctional families do not have these rituals. I was talking with someone recently, and I'm not even sure exactly where it was, but we were talking about, might have been a training session I was in recently, and the trainer was talking about, we have a couple substance abuse programs. Some of them, when they bring, or not necessarily substance abuse treatment programs, but family counseling programs, whatever. One of the elements of the family counseling program itself is to have the entire family come in and sit down to a meal together. The several families in this larger treatment group, let's say, they start out with a meal with the parents and the children together, and then they go into the counseling afterwards, and one of the reasons that that's thought to be therapeutic for a lot of our families is some of the families that we encounter are so dysfunctional that they don't know what a normal sit-down meal is like, especially with families with substance abusing parents and things like that. Those kinds of things that most of us take for granted. There are lots of children out there growing up without that, and so these daily rituals are something that's a sign of a healthier family. In the absence of these things, will suggest to you that you're working with a family in trouble. One other thing about family assessments that I wanted to mention, that's cultural differences. In Alaska and in South Central Alaska, we have many different cultures, families from many different cultures, indigenous cultures, foreign cultures, that live here, and so we encounter individuals and families with a lot of different kinds of structures. So these cultural differences will set families apart from one culture to the next. And as you take diversity classes, you'll learn that it's very important to understand the cultural differences in families and what that means in terms of working with individuals and what you can expect in your work with families. But it's also important to realize that within the cultural groups themselves, there are also differences from family to family. And so it isn't that all Hispanic families or all Asian families or all African American families or all Caucasian families are the same. There's often there's many variations within each cultural group because every family is unique. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, as we look at the issue of family violence, the authors tell us that one of the things that contributes to the notion of violence in families is this common view that we have that families are safe places for men, women, and children, and really, families are idealized in a lot of ways. We have this idea that families provide the nurturance that all of its members needs, and when families don't do that, there's a great disappointment among its family members. This sometimes can set up some discord within its relationships. A lot of times violence occurs in families, what we say behind closed doors. That the notion in our culture, very much so, is that the old saying is a man's home is his castle. And the emphasis on man and his, of course, this is in patriarchy, where men are vested with a lot of authority and often have a sense of entitlement in their family system because of that. And the violence that can occur often occurs as very hidden, ignored, and like it says here, unnoticed. Family members that are victims of violence often go out and interact with others on a day-to-day basis and find ways to hide that violence and won't talk about that violence with other people. Definitions of family violence lack agreement, and we'll be talking about that more in a few slides. And another thing that's worth keeping in mind as we work through this book is that probably statistics in family violence are underestimates and really need to be viewed cautiously. You will notice as you read through the chapters that the authors will give you some statistics that say one thing about a particular problem and then go through other studies where the results of those studies were very different. In a sense, this really is kind of a scholar's book, because it isn't a book that gives you a single theory and tells you that this is the way it is. But what the authors do is they look at each of these problems and they expose you to the different studies, and these studies oftentimes are very contradictory. The results are contradictory, and what that tells you then is that we really don't know in certain areas what's going on or what causes things or what the results are of certain kinds of behaviors in family members' parts. And so that's important to know too. It tells you something about where the field is still growing in understanding things. But likelihood is, because most studies in family violence require self-reports, you're going to have underestimates of what's really going on out there. So that's just something to keep in mind. In intrafamilial non-fatal abuse, here are some interesting points. Women and children are more likely to be victimized in their own homes than on the street. Intimate family violence is something that is a larger problem for persons more than it is crime in general. Parents are the perpetrators in most child maltreatment cases, something like 80%. And in fact, I have an article that I clipped out of the Anchorage Daily News in July of 2012. It's called 5 Basic Reasons Why Parents Kill. And the interesting thing is that it says that one of every 33 homicides in the United States is a child being killed by his mother or father. 1 in 33 homicides in the United States is a child being killed by his or her parent. That's a really amazing statistic when you think about the frequency that represents. 52% of the women, that's a little bit more than half of women, and 2/3 of the men report having been assaulted as a child by a caretaker. And the majority of the rapes were perpetrated by individuals closely associated with the victim. And 22% of women, 7% of men reporting experiencing interpersonal violence at some point in their lives. Again, remember that these statistics are likely to be underestimates. You can see there that in 2007, which was the latest statistics they had, I believe, for this issue, almost 1,800 children died from abuse and neglect in 1 year. And those children, one or both parents, were the cause of 70% of those fatalities. And so, and on and on and on here, you see 60% of females, 40% of males killed by intimate partners in 16 different states. Females are more likely to be killed by intimates or known acquaintances, while males are more likely to be killed by unknown assailants or known acquaintances. Now, this is one thing that's worth just kind of put this little note in your mind as you go forward. When we in some weeks on down the road, we're going to be looking at intimate partner violence, and one of the debates that is very active in this field right now is the whole notion that of female perpetrators, and whether females batter men just as much as men batter women. And it is a social study, it's a social topic and a social debate, and it's also a political topic and a political debate, and it has something to do with the definitions of family violence. Certainly there are females that assault males in intimate relationships, and those females get arrested. Feminist authors will tell you that the overemphasis on females as batterers really undermines the whole movement to rid society of family violence, because it is essentially patriarchy kind of taking over and saying, well, men don't really batter women so badly. Women batter men just as badly. So this statistic tells you here that women are more likely killed by intimates, whereas males are more likely to be killed by unknown assailants. So that suggests to me, that's one thing that points towards the probability that really, when we talk about family violence, when we talk about domestic violence, we're really talking about something that is much more a problem for women than for men. This is just one factor in that, and that's a big debate we'll be talking about later in the semester. Families should be able to deal with problems in day-to-day life and teach its members to overcome those problems. And when they can't do that or don't do that, the dysfunction that might exist in families tend to compound those problems. Once again, this is another point from the Cross and Tower text, Understanding Child Abuse and Neglect. And she talks about what some of the things are that happen, that causes family systems to fail. And among the kinds of things that happen in families is the failure to complete basic tasks. This would be, raising children properly, treating children with respect, sharing duties and responsibilities and power evenly in the household, those kinds of things. Making sure kids get out the door every morning to go to school, being sure that they have food on the table at night and that they're not exposed to violence in their day-to-day living, that they have a healthy amount of entertainment and that they're treated properly, that boundaries are respected within family systems, and the proper distance between adults and children are kept in certain areas of life, but still that they receive that nurturance and emotional support. And when they fail to get that, that's another failure in families. A failure to deal with the developmental tasks of families or family members and to deal with crises that arise. And failures to deal with social pressures upon the family. These are some of the things that cause families to fail. Families that experience failures across several spheres in life are called multi-problem families. Cross and Tower suggests, and this is something that I'll probably say again later in the semester, Cross and Tower suggests that there is sort of a contract in American society because we really do believe in privacy. And this is particularly true, perhaps more so in Alaska than other parts of the United States, but privacy is important all over. And this notion that the government really should not intervene, does not have a role in telling us how to raise our children, as long as we meet as parents the expectations, as long as the family meets the expectations that society puts on it to produce healthy children. So when they're failing to perform these basic tasks and to respect boundaries and, deal with crises properly and social pressures and things like this, essentially they're not living up to those expectations that in that contract. And that's when the state then has a right or a responsibility to step in and protect the members of the family, whether it be its children, its elderly, or its victims of violence and things like that. There are many different kinds of things that contribute to why families become violent, and the text talks about some structural factors. For instance, simply the amount of time families spend together. The more time you're under the same roof together, the more likely it is that, on the one hand, with some individuals at least, the more likely it is that there will be some violence in the family. On the other hand, perhaps it spells less time can spell more likelihood of violence, just because of the fact that the connection and bonding that goes on between individuals and family isn't happening. Power differentials in families. We believe strongly in a patriarchal system in America. And not only is it men having power over the household and over women in the household and the children in the household, but also that adults have control over the children. Now, that control is there for a good reason in terms of teaching kids as they grow older how to negotiate the world and what is right and what is wrong and how to conduct oneself, those kinds of things. But still, those power differentials, which kind of enable the household to function, nonetheless also can set up abusive and violent patterns in the household because of the emphasis upon authority. Individuals may be dependent on other individuals, may not be able to fight back because of that. If individuals are economically dependent upon an individual who is focused upon maintaining authority and who is abusive, they may not be able to leave that person, and so that would perpetuate the cycle of violence in the families. family relationships protected by law, not easily severed. I can tell you, working in child protection as I do, it's one of those debates every day when we see children in our work that we believe may have safety, are in questionable situations as far as safety is concerned. We have to ask ourselves whether or not we have, let's say, the grounds necessary, the legal grounds to step in and, if necessary, remove children or take action to require parents to do certain things on behalf of their children. It isn't an easy thing to go in and just tell parents they have to do things. And there's an assumption that we have an authority when we step in to families. We don't really have that, because parents have the ultimate say in what goes on, unless the state steps in and actually removes children from their parents, and that's something that is only done under very particular circumstances. Privacy and autonomy is something you're going to see again and again in the discussions of violence in families, because once again, I think we really value privacy. We value our rights to make our own decisions in America. It's almost a part of our Constitution, perhaps. And we idealize the family. We believe that, for one thing, parental rights should supersede children's rights. And there is a movement, actually, and I believe it's the United Nations, for a Children's Bill of Rights. And most of the nations around the world have signed off or are willing to sign off on this. And one of the elements of the Children's Bill of Rights is that children should be free of violence, that parents should not be allowed to hit their children. And I was told recently that only 2 countries have failed to agree to this, and one is Somalia, and the other is the United States. We really think that parents should have a right to hit their kids if they want to, and that's a part of this notion that parents have rights that supersede children's rights. In a sense, children are seen as property, and that from a sociological standpoint, you can kind of go back the olden days when children were really sort of little economic factories for families, because they work in the farm and things like this. They produced goods that families needed to get by. And so parents sort of had a vested interest in maintaining control of their children. Thus, children were sort of like property, and there's still a sense of that and underlying the parent-child relationship today in America. And so because of that, parents believe that they should control the development of their children. And we have this sense that family members always act in the best interest of their kids, and that's not true. But many people in our culture don't realize that. Once again, privacy and autonomy kind of comes into this picture as well. Family norms. Sometimes in some families there is an acceptance of a certain amount of aggression. For instance, spanking is an example of that, and I was just touching on that. Spanking in Alaska, for instance, it's not, and in most states around the nation, if not all, it's not against the law to hit your children. I think that the idea is the law believes that when parents hit their children, they're doing it out of disciplining their children, and some people will point to the Bible, in fact, to say that spare the rod and spoil the child, and as a justification for spanking. And there are other ways of interpreting that I'm not going to get into right now, but that there is a belief that a certain amount of aggression within families are okay, and this is one of the reasons that kind of underlies the violence in family. And then just in general in our culture, there's a tolerance of violence, and in fact it's even encouraged and supported. I have to tell you, the first place that you can see that is Sunday afternoon, the football games, and it's a violent sport. I just don't think there's. Personally, I don't think there's any debate to that, and there may be those that do debate that with me, but boxing, hockey, all these kinds of things where there's a lot of physical contact, and we like the fights, we like seeing people get hit, we see replays when people get hit. The football teams, football games and things like this. You see those replays. Many years back, Joe Theismann, I think, was a quarterback for the Washington Redskins and had a wonderful career ahead of him, and had his leg shattered in a football game one day, and that ended his career as a football player, at least. And that scene where his leg was broken and was just a very graphic scene, and just was played over and over and over again in the media for so long. We talk about objectifying females, and by the same token, males are objectified when it comes to I think in terms of these violent sports and things like that as well. Violence is socially learned. There are many studies that you have probably already been exposed to in sociology and psychology that tell you that children learn violence from their role models, and in fact, in particular, little boys learn from fathers how to be violent, and that's one of the concerns we have for children observing domestic violence. And just like not only within our culture, but in other cultures around the world, violence is sometimes accepted or encouraged. And many cultures really hold firmly to the patriarchal notion that men should be dominant as well. There are also individual factors that contribute to family violence, including mental illness or mental disorders, disruptions in attachments, jealousy, anger, those types of things as well. And while each of those have a role to play in family violence, I think as the semester goes along, you're going to see that these are sort of little wild cards that that come into the scene. They're not really the root causes of family violence, even though when violence erupts in a household, we tend to think about them being the perpetrator being sick or being mentally ill, or he had a jealous rage or something like that, and that's usually not the case. It occurs on occasion, but that's not the usual case. I mentioned to you that the notion of family violence has really emerged throughout history, and so there are a number of things that have happened that have kind of brought this to our attention. There has certainly been a lot of extra attention in the academic world. More and more of these courses like this one have been taught in the last really 20 years. When I had my social work education, we had no courses on. I had a course on child welfare, but not a course on child abuse. And in fact, child abuse was just coming to be recognized in those days, and really the child protection system was just becoming formed. And no, that wasn't back in the days of Adam and Eve. I mean, this was just a little while ago, and so really it's been the last 20 or 30 years that we have come to recognize the existence of family violence and began to see it as a social problem. And the media has certainly caught up in this as well. And particular cases have been very famous over the years. Probably the most famous domestic violence case is the O.J. Simpson case, where despite what the jury believed, most everybody else in the United States believed he killed his wife and her male friend that night. And it kind of brought the whole discussion of violence in intimate relationships out into the open finally. And here in a relationship with a wealthy family, in fact, a privileged family. There's been some progress in reducing violence against children and women on an international level. And in the United States, what they refer to as claims makers in our textbook began defining various forms of family violence as social problems. Social constructionism, which is really this sense that that we kind of define things in our system. Things don't really exist. We recognize and we describe and define things a certain way. Family violence moved from being a social condition, this kind of thing that will just exist and that we have to live with, and we now define it as a problem, something that we need to resolve and change. Does it seem like a big problem? Does it seem impossible to change? I would say to you, for those of you at least that are of a certain age, you'll remember when smoking was the norm in restaurants and in public places and in public buildings. even in homes. Nowadays, people in their own homes a lot of times won't even smoke inside their homes anymore. They step outside to smoke a cigarette. You can't smoke in restaurants. You can't smoke in bars. You can't smoke within 50 feet of the entrance of any public building any longer. 30 or 40 years ago, that would have been unimaginable. If somebody sat down next to you in a restaurant and they were bothered by your smoke, the smoker would say, "We were smoking. You sat next to us. Go ahead and move." But nowadays it's quite the opposite of that. We've had a real cultural shift about smoking, and it's something that hasn't happened elsewhere in the world, for that matter. Europeans would say, sometimes we forget, Americans, you don't smoke anymore. It's really changed, and if that problem can change, that kind of a cultural shift can occur in something like that, it can occur in family violence in other areas as well. Child maltreatment also has been discovered. Children as a group really weren't even, individual needs of children as a group weren't really recognized until perhaps 100 to 125 years ago, with the child saving movement and then finally child labor laws and those kinds of things coming into existence. Children were worked and were regarded almost as mini adults until about 100 or so years ago. And frankly, part of the process for recognizing that children had special needs had more to do with economic needs than it did any kind of social consciousness raising, because we had some eras of economic depressions and labor problems and not enough work and jobs and things like this, and children had to be pushed out of the job market in order to clear jobs for adults. And so compulsory education laws were put in place, and juvenile courts were established, and also the whole new life stage of adolescence with G. Stanley Hall's big book on adolescence around 100 years ago was established, so that even teenagers now weren't grown up yet. All of these kinds of things began to lead us towards a recognition. Well, we began to see children differently, whether we really recognized that there was a difference or not yet. And so as we saw children being different, then we had to start treating them differently. And so, the first child abuse court case was tried in 1874, and it's the famous Mary Ellen story. If you haven't heard it, there was a Mary Ellen was adopted by a couple, I believe, that lived in some apartment building in New York City, and neighbors could hear her screaming and crying day after day after day, and she would be left alone. Nobody ever saw her, though, and so they called the different authorities, and nobody could figure out what to do about this. And finally, some social worker or welfare worker or whatever talked to individuals with the ASPCA to see how it is that they took animals away from its owners when they were mistreated, because there were laws protecting dogs and cats, but not laws protecting children. And the myth goes that Mary Ellen was removed and taken into court as a member of the animal kingdom and removed from their parents under that basis. That's not really the case, but the woman who did finally act to remove Mary Ellen from the family did so after consulting with ASPCA experts about how they go about doing it with animals. Wayward children were recognized around the turn of the century again, and some of those were farmed out to other parts of the country. Do you ever watch Little House on the Prairie? You remember how Charles and Laura Ingalls found little Albert in Minneapolis, and took him out to the farm with him. He was running the streets. He was a little juvenile delinquent. Kids were being farmed out and things like that to get them out of the city. They weren't being taken care of properly by their parents, and there was a lot of concern that they were going to grow up to be dependent upon the system like their parents. And so neglected children were recognized earlier, but it wasn't really until the 60s where there were laws began to be enacted to protect children from physical abuse. And this developed out of a recognition by Helfer and Kemp in Colorado, recognized that children were being seen by doctors who had injury after injury after injury that wasn't being reported to the authorities, and doctors were concerned that calling it to the attention of the authorities might get them in trouble because they weren't sure if they were being abused or not. And so through the child maltreatment movement, Helfer and Kemp began to establish the first mandatory reporting laws for child abuse that required doctors to report suspected abuse, and also gave them protections against lawsuits and those kinds of things if they were wrong. Today, all 50 states have mandatory reporting laws for child abuse, but that all started back in the 1960s. And even still, child sexual abuse, the recognition of this is still emerging. And when I started in child protection, back in this was the 1970s when I started in that. We had our neglect cases. We also recognized physical abuse cases, but we didn't have a lot of sexual abuse cases yet. And more as time has gone on, certain things have happened in our culture that has raised an awareness of child sexual abuse, and so it also has become a part of our area of concern. Child neglect, which is mentioned here, sometimes is kind of shoved aside or forgotten. Chronic child neglect actually leaves more damage on children's brain development and other areas of their life than even physical abuse does. Intimate partner violence, because the women's movement that emerged in the 60s again, moved from securing the right to vote to focusing upon the victimization of women within the family. In the 1960s, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence was founded in order to continue to develop public interest in wife abuse, and the government and healthcare entities eventually became involved in that as well. And the awareness about violence against women had become more mainstream. The women's movement itself was very influential, and there has been a lot of consciousness raising going on in the last 50 or 60 years, first among women themselves, and still very much so a process for men of recognizing women's rights to be independent and to control their sexuality, to control their birthing and all sorts of things like that, to be able to make their own choices, to be economically independent, and to have equal standing in a household. There are many institutions in our lives that work against that, including things like religion, which really emphasizes, the men in many aspects of traditional Christian religion and other religions. I think really place vest authority in men. And so the women's movement have a lot of different things to struggle against as they try to establish equality for women. Dating violence has become more of an area of interest since the 1980s. More recently, stalking, where it's just people following, because they know that's the sign that something worse is coming. Cyber stalking, those kinds of things. Elder abuse has also become more recognized in society, and not all states yet have mandatory reporting laws for elder abuse, but it's coming. And likewise, with some states have mandatory reporting laws if you're aware of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, but not very many of them yet have that. And that, again, I think kind of goes back to the man's home being his castle, that whole belief in the emphasis upon the privacy of one's household. And this is an issue that is becoming more a point of topic around the world. Many people don't like Hillary Clinton very much. She's a champion for women's rights around the world. In fact, has spoken out in favor of women's rights in China and other places where women are not yet recognized and given equal standing. And there are understudied groups that I think we're going to touch on later in the semester, and here are some of them, including gay and lesbian partners, different ethnic and racial minorities, those disabled individuals, and intimates in the military, diverse religious groups, those kinds of things. We'll be taking a look at those understudied groups later in the semester. I goofed up. Don't go away. I don't know how to get back there. There we are. Whew. Sorry. So defining the terms of family violence, rape, all those kinds of things are really an integral part of the process, in understanding and legitimizing the study of family violence. And there is a real lack of consensus about what causes family violence, and so it makes it very difficult to be able to really define family violence and then to enact them and get protections put in the laws and those kinds of things. So this study is something that I think that's very important, and is something that as you go about your careers, you can continue to contribute to this and hopefully bring this field along so that 20 or 30 years from now, when you're teaching this class, you're going to be talking about a lot of very different things. And what I'm talking about today is going to seem very old school, I hope. There are some feminist thinkers, and I kind of hinted at this in the first slide maybe I didn't hint so much as told you directly about this in the first slide for this week's learning unit, that there are feminist thinkers that say that really using the term family violence is sort of a sanitized way of making kind of easy for us to conceptualize this, that really it diffuses responsibility for the harm that's occurred, the sense that if it's family violence implies that somehow all members of the family have some part to play in this, and the picture that it kind of conjures up is everybody being violent in the family system, and this one particular author that I used some years ago in my other class, Eichenberg, said that we really ought to call it what it is, and it's woman battering is what it is, and let's keep the focus on that, because this is what now she's talking particularly about domestic violence, but she even says domestic violence is really the same kind of a thing. Let's not try to sugarcoat this. Let's call it what it is. It's battering, and it is perpetrated by an individual in the family who is in control and who does this. And so, and Eichenberg and other feminist authors believe that male violence against women, especially intimates, has to be ignored because patriarchal social structures effectively use violence against women as an important means of social control. Eichenberg points out that when you look at the system that monitors and manages family violence in our world, the law enforcement officers who respond to domestic violence calls largely, almost always, are male. The judges the attorneys that represent the perpetrators very often are male. The individuals sitting behind the bench who make decisions about whether perpetrators are let out or not, whether restraining orders are issued or not, are usually male. The people who are writing the laws in our state capital or in the nation's capital are predominantly male. The people who write the books and who conduct the research, even about women, are predominantly male. And so all of this, these family violence statutes and theories and everything that is intended to protect women are filtered through the screens built by men. And so she says, patriarchy will assure that family violence and wife battering will continue on in perpetuity because of that. It's an interesting, challenging thought that well, as a male teaching this class, I would say to you, is worth considering. We'll also be looking at practice, policy, and prevention issues later in the semester, and in each of these chapters, in fact, they'll talk about some different sort of model programs that are used in different places around the nation. That are used for treatment purposes in the different kinds of violence that we're going to be studying. School-based programs, family support training programs, community awareness programs, those kinds of things. And then some of the interventions socially that we have, such as mandatory reporting laws, foster care adoption, family preservation grants, criminal justice responses. How does the legal system respond, and how can it change to better manage this problem? How can we provide better treatment for offenders and victims? Establish safe houses for those victims, and pull everybody together within the community to respond in a healthy fashion. An example of coordinated community responses is the movement, the SART movement, this Sexual Assault Response Team movement, and more recently for children, the Child Advocacy Center movements. And in the Kenai area here where I am, we have both a strong SART and CAC teams now, and there are CAC teams all around the state as well as SART Sexual Assault Response Teams, so that when an adult is raped, that's the SART team, or when a child is a victim of sexual abuse, the Child Advocacy Center team, join together and have a joint interview of the child. So one person interviews the child. The remainder of the individuals involved, the child protection worker, the nurses, who have examined the child, perhaps the lawyers that are going to be prosecuting the case, sit on the other side of the window. They're not in the room, and they observe that interview, so protects the child from repeated re-interviewing about what happened to the child. It creates a record of that interview. It demonstrates that the interview was done forensically appropriately, that the child wasn't led into certain responses that would build a case that didn't otherwise exist. Those kinds of things. That's a coordinated community response that addresses one particular problem, and that's just one example of that. There are many other kinds of things that can be done in the various areas that we're going to be studying this semester. There are some myths about family violence, and I believe this is the last slide, and I'm not going to look because I'll go back into that black screen that I took you to a little while ago, but just some things to think about as we close this discussion for this week. A notion, first of all, that family violence is uncommon. It is not uncommon. It's hidden, and it's quiet, and it is all around us. And this is something that's very important for us to recognize. And if you don't know this now, when you work in this field, you're going to come to see it. There's a notion that violence is limited to people that have low education and low socioeconomic means, and that's not true. Individuals who have more income can find more ways to address those problems, perhaps, and also can find people who are inclined not to interpret things in ways that would be reported legally. I believe that if you go to see treatment providers in this community and other communities, and you belong to a poor family, or a family who belongs to a lower socioeconomic group, you are more likely to have that abuse, the same abuse, reported than if you went to some providers as a member of the upper middle class. I do think that's true. Abused children always become abusive partners or parents, and that's not true. Some time ago, I read a study that said 1 in 3 untreated victims of physical abuse would turn around and abuse their own children later. 1 in 3 untreated. And there are a lot of other studies that give you different kind of statistics, but the bottom line is that while most abusive parents and abusive partners have been abused themselves as children, it doesn't work the other way around. It doesn't necessarily dictate that abused children will become violent themselves. And some of the other myths here, that battered women ask for it, that rape victims asked for it or wanted it, that family violence sometimes just happens. Alcohol and drugs are the cause of family violence. They co-occur. They occur at the same time. They're not the cause. At any time, you can't get alcohol treatment or drug treatment and stop family violence. You may need to get it first, but there are other interventions you have to take to end family violence. And you can see some of the remainder of these kinds of myths. Some people cannot be raped, and any coercive sexual act is not damaging. Or anyway, coercive sexual contact is not damaging. Some people can't be raped. There is a notion by some people, for instance, that males can't be raped. They can't be the victims of sexual assault, and males oftentimes will will fall into that, because that's what the society says, that they shouldn't be a victim. They should be the aggressor. They should like sex. And some people think that if a male had an erection, he must have been sexually sexually excited, so therefore wasn't being raped. Those are all myths we can talk about later in the semester. Finally, if he ever laid a hand on me, I would leave, is also a myth. It isn't just that simple. Without looking further, I think that's my last slide, and I'll click to the left or to the right in a second just to make sure of this. But that being the case, I want to thank you for staying tuned in this week. And if you have any feedback for me about this, I'll be happy to hear it from you. Once again, please be sure that you have worked through every slide in the weekly course content this week, and try to get into that habit early and know what you're looking for. Okay. So, any questions? Please contact me. You'll find a discussion board question posted for you to respond to, and also a blog. And I'm going to be changing the name of the blogs to journals. A journal entry also for you to make, where you'll be communicating just with me individually about the topic. The discussion boards are open to the public, your own classmates, that is. And so hope you enjoy this learning unit, and thanks very much for paying attention. And I'll talk to you next week. Bye for now.